Coming up, the latest New York Post article from Brian Lewis suggests that the Brooklyn Nets are committed to Ben Simmons next year. We break down why it's the obvious route forward in the short term and the interesting Dennis Schroeder wrinkle that should inform the offseason ahead. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And Doug, as we say, the news cycle never stops with the Brooklyn Nets. The season isn't officially over. And already, though, Brian Lewis from the New York Post giving all the indications of what only the Nets would have kind of vibing out there. We're committed to Ben Simmons going into next year.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've sort of expected this to some degree, and maybe not to like this level, but Lewis, who, you know, is well connected within the Nets organization and puts out an article about Dennis Schroeder effectively, right? About like sort of how he's stepped up this season and how they had to, but the title is, you know, Nets face big decision at point guard next season. Essentially positing the idea that it's Dennis Schroeder or Ben Simmons, and the team, you know, has these different choices. This is, I'll just say it right to start. It's a little hard, not Lewis's reporting, but the sentiment from the Nets organization is hard to take seriously when you look at Ben Simmons, right? Like, who at this point is saying to themselves, ooh, we got a point guard battle brewing in Brooklyn next year between Dennis Schroeder, who's, you know, finished the season better than expected, I think, since coming off the trade deadline, and Ben Simmons, who's barely played in 3 years. And like, who's being intellectually honest about this and being like, it's going to be, things are really ramping up for a training camp battle to see who's going to captain the Nets ship next year at point guard. I mean, like, who are we really fooling at this point? And I think that it leads to an interesting discussion around sort of like the idea behind narrative and truth when it comes to players. And I think this is like one of those real canary in the coal mine examples of, like, is there anyone in the Nets organization that actually believes this? Or is it just lip service to stay positive with a player because at this point negativity doesn't hurt you at all? So I don't blame the organization for maybe, you know, throwing this out there, but I mean, who on earth could take it seriously?
And by the way, when you hear quotes like he was a leader right when he got in, that's interim head coach Kevin Ollie speaking about Dennis Schroeder. He brings championship mentality. He just has a natural ability to lead, ability to win. You know winners when you see them. They hold everybody accountable, but they make themselves full of accountability too. That's what he did first and foremost. And when you hear that, I think, again, to bring it back to it, competition brewing, you know, narrative wise, and we remember during the season people saying that it seems like Ben Simmons is well liked within the locker room. But what matters first and foremost at the NBA level, it's, can you produce? So if you're the players, especially some of the young guys maybe that are playing with Dennis Schroeder right now, that's the high level question I would ask. Would you even want to entertain having a position battle, assuming that Ben Simmons was healthy? Or from a player level, I would assume Dennis Schroeder is the starting point guard for this team at the beginning of next season. Ben Simmons cannot take that away from him if you just look at track record, reliability, consistency, and then the way that he seems to carry himself inside the locker room and on the court.
Yeah, look, when you look at the Nets situation, right, regarding Simmons, they're in an impossible spot. Now, they put themselves in this spot, but they're in an impossible spot. They own $40.3 million next year, guaranteed. It's the last year of the contract. Much has been talked about, you know, about whether that contract was going to be able to be moved or not. We've been at least we both have been pretty firm on the idea that moving that contract is not going to be very easy. They've talked about there's not going to be a buyout. We've also said many times there's no reason we ever thought Simmons would accept a buyout. So like we never thought buyout was even on the table because we were like, he won't accept it. So that's kind of the end of that story. And I wouldn't either, by the way. And so that's the end of that story. But when you look at Simmons, the joke, you know, the old adage, the best ability is availability, which is like not true. The best ability is ability. Really and then availability also helps. Which I always think is funny because like I'm available every night, but like that's not an ability for me.
No one's called my number yet to take center court for the Brooklyn Nets.
It helps, but it's not the best ability. Simmons over the last 3 seasons has played a grand total of no, excuse me. Yes, over the last 3 seasons has played a grand total of 57 games and
Not
just
bad.
around 1,400 minutes. He hasn't played. He hasn't played at all. 1,400 minutes, by the way, would rank him like in the hundreds of players this season. Of just like hundreds of players, over 100 players have played more than 1,400 minutes just this season. So he's just not available. He's unreliable. The key part of this discussion, which I mean is barely a discussion, but is that they owe him the money and they have no other outs. So what else could you possibly say about this, right? And so the only other thing to say from a Nets perspective is to go into it and say, you know, we're really counting on him next year. He's going to be part of the team. It's not true, and it puts fans in an interesting situation where it like becomes very hard to sort of like believe narratives coming out of teams, or like because you just read this and you just say to yourself, I mean, who do they think we are? It's funny, but I get it though.
I do. On the one hand, I do get it. On the other hand, I don't get the timing of it. Like you're coming off a game,
That's a good point.
a great post-game interview with Dennis Schroeder. Everyone's talking about, hey, what mentality did you bring in here? How much have you liked it here? There's quotes inside the Brian Lewis article to the effect of Schroeder saying, yeah, I want to be here. Obviously, I'm under contract, and he understands the business side of things. Like he seems to, again, bring a level of professionalism that you want everybody to have when they come into your roster. And the season is winding down, and the season's over, and you're eliminated from the playoffs and from the play-in. Like, we've all had these conversations. The media has covered this thing soup to nuts. When Sean Marks gives his mid-season interview, of course it comes up. Why bother bringing it up right now? And this isn't Brian Lewis out of thin air saying, you know what I find fascinating? Like you said, he's connected. This is a narrative that they want to have out there. And sometimes I think the Brooklyn Nets get in their own way of asserting narratives that you kind of want to just go by the wayside. Go to the offseason. Let whatever's going to happen, and worry about this conversation when it comes to the draft, when it comes to training camp, and when it comes to seeing Ben Simmons healthy again. Because guess what? You're going to get right back into that cycle again as we start to see him ramp up activity and all those other things associated with his play. So I don't understand why sometimes the Brooklyn Nets seem to want to put out an enormous amount of fog to cover up maybe what is the underlying intention or agenda, but we never seem to really get a clear picture of where they're headed, especially over these last 18 months or so.
Yeah, and that's what makes it really frustrating as a fan is we've seen this multiple times. They put out narratives, and I do want to talk more about Simmons here because I think it is like sort of it's really instructive to understand like sort of how this Nets offseason is going to go. But they put out constant narratives which just don't align with the reality. Right, like we talked about this literally on yesterday's episode when it came to Mikal Bridges. They said like there's a constant string of narratives that you just can't circle the square when you look at it. When you're like, well, hold on a second, that just doesn't make sense. Like we're gonna pair. He's not a superstar, right? Or Simmons is part of the plan. It was like, what plan? Like he's not around. So like how could that be the case? Or Dennis Schroeder, is gonna face some competition from who? He's the only point guard. Like it's none of these things that make any sense. Well, we don't know what to do with Cam Thomas. I mean, the list is literally endless when it comes to narratives versus reality. And I get it. Running an organization is hard, and there has to be some kind of like sort of subtext to what's going on because you're dealing with personalities. And I'm sure actually that's probably the hardest part. But at the same time, you put it great where you're like, you just also don't have to say anything. We all get it. We all get it.
Right.
57 games. He doesn't play. The career could be on the edge of being over. No one is doing a victory lap on that. It totally sucks. But at the same time, just let the next season start. Yeah. Like, don't even put this as a thought out there, even if it's placating an ego or something like that. It just doesn't make sense at this point.
Coming with 3 games left in the season, finishing your final game at Barclays, beating the Toronto Raptors, nobody was clamoring for an update on Ben Simmons and what it looks like for the offseason. But we're going to get into how this informs the offseason, whether or not there are other factors at play here, like Dennis Smith Jr. and his own injury track record that muddled the backcourt plans for the Brooklyn Nets. And also, by the way, Nicholas Claxton and Noah Clowney. That tandem informs Ben Simmons. We'll go ahead and get to that in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, I'll tell you about our friends over at Stitch Fix. It's easy to talk about Stitch Fix. I'm wearing Stitch Fix right now. It gives you that instant confidence boost to get you into an outfit that makes you look really good. As you can see on YouTube right now, I mean, point taken. We got the Flag and Anthem hoodie on right now. Came from the unwrapping we got from Stitch Fix. And the great thing about Stitch Fix is just like having a personal stylist that works with you to upgrade your wardrobe, You're going to get a professional in there. You're going to find new on-trend favorites. Are going to work for you. Some things you're going to love, like I did with this hoodie right here. Some things you send back, they're going to send you more options. You're just going to keep coming to have that wardrobe fully upgraded. Give you the size. You're going to give your size, your style. You're going to give your budget preferences. Stitch Fix is going to work with you. Those boxes are going to come when you want them. Okay. Where you want them. You open in front of the family like I did. Everyone gets really, really excited to see dad's new fit. That is what Stitch Fix gives you. It's style that makes you feel as good as you look. Get started today at stitchfix.com/lockedon. That's stitchfix.com/lockedon. stitchfix.com/lockedon.
And when you're done with that, why don't you go ahead and know that passion, drive, and patience, it's the formula for winning championships and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to ride or every single time your money back. Because eBay Motors, you know you are burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you'll ever need at prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home a huge win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Okay, so as we have this discussion, Brian Lewis article outlining the big decision potentially for the Brooklyn Nets in the backcourt with Ben Simmons. Go ahead. What's your next bullet point about Ben Simmons? Because I actually think when we talk about this sample size of Nicholas Claxton and Noah Clowney, I mean it when I say it informs the way you think about Ben Simmons going forward, because that was the thing. Oh, can these players, Ben Simmons and Nicholas Claxton, function together? We mostly thought they could not. Now, all of a sudden, there's another big body who can, not the same skill set, but it does change the way you perceive forming your rotations going into next season.
Yeah, so the long held understanding was that it was really hard and was for Ben Simmons and Nick Claxton to play together, right? So there's two non-spacers,
big deal.
Yeah, right. Two non-spacers on the court at the same time. And really it's not even like either had this like great post play either, which really no one in the NBA does anymore. But like, even with that, you could have probably faked it a little bit because you have superior post presence than on an offensive skill set. It might mitigate it some, but again, like the modern NBA doesn't really roll that way. So you have these two guys who, when they were paired together, it was just so hard. The only two guys literally in the world that were able to make it work were Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, who were the two like great 3-level scorers that we've ever seen in the NBA. And like that made it work. Yeah. But everyone else, it kind of just like, it just wasn't happening. Now, as you enter an offseason, like headed toward a Nick Claxton decision, I think it's so clear that Simmons like doesn't fit with him. But the reason you kind of had to talk yourself into it at times was because, if they were going to play this switching defensive style, which Claxton's really good at, then it was really going to help to have Simmons there, because they could be like these, guys who could basically switch 1 through 5. And that is like kind of a defensive superpower when you go into an all switching scheme, right? Like there's just nowhere to sort of get away. There's nowhere to kind of like land your best defender. Now they have other weak links, but like, taking 2/5 of those guys and making it a really hard part. And then maybe you throw in Mikal Bridges, right? Like now all of a sudden you've got like 3 really good switch defenders. Well, now you have Noah Clowney, who can space the floor. I think that's showing more and more every night. Doesn't have the same on-ball skills as Simmons, but if you have a kind of a real-ish point guard and Dennis Schroeder, well, maybe you can just keep your head above water for another season with that group. But Simmons doesn't fit there. Like Simmons doesn't fit into that mold. Like you can't start him with that group for sure. And at that point, like what's he really doing for you? This is going to be fascinating on 2 accounts. One, because we're not sure what's going to happen with Claxton. And I think there's some real tea leaves where he's not going to be back. But
well, 2, by the way, we'll get into this on another episode, but just they said it at the end of that last game, at the last home game there. It was Frank Iasola who said Nick Claxton, who very well could have played his last game in a Nets uniform in Barclays Center, made a real statement on his way out the door. And I just thought that resonated, that he would at least mention that there as they cap off the homestand for the season.
Yeah, because he's for sure connected, like in there through yes. And that didn't feel like an off the cuff mark. But like, so you have these things putting together. But honestly, even if you didn't, like, even if he was to leave, I still am
It's
hard
still
pressed to really see like this great, awesome fit and just not dream on it. And uh, well, okay, well, so starting from there, I mean, like,
okay.
would Simmons affect your Claxton decision at all?
No,
Like,
it can't.
like,
It can't. Because okay, it does impact my Claxton decision in the fact that I have $40 million on the books, right? And I can't get rid of that money from Ben Simmons going into the upcoming season. So from a financial standpoint, it has a factor. But from a, well, if we are, split on the idea, do we want to commit X amount of dollars to Claxton or not? Ben Simmons and what he is as a player, if healthy and on the court, cannot factor into that, because whatever Nick Claxton isn't, what he has been after having a slow go there, had some illnesses related to missing time, but he's been healthy. He's been on the court. He's been available. The minutes have continued to grow here. Like I'll go back to what you said. The best ability is really good ability, but then also availability factors in. And Ben Simmons is way too far down that pecking order to let Claxton go and think that Ben Simmons will pair with Noah Clowney over the course of this season, and then we'll reevaluate the next year after that. It's just fraught with disaster. What if he goes down? Now you're right back to the same concern about where's our size? How are we defending? Now you're going to put exponential pressure on Noah Clowney in his first full season to be the anchor of the defense and a critical offensive piece. That's way too much. So I think you have to look at it through the open eyes of how do we feel about Claxton objectively, and Ben Simmons can hold no weight on that decision.
yeah, agree with that. So like I agree that that shouldn't factor in. Now, whether or not it will, again, it's unclear. Like we don't really know, sort of how the Nets view their cap space post Ben Simmons, where they clearly just have to be waiting with bated breath for this contract to expire, right? To open up 25, 26. As of right now, the only guys under contract, Mikal at 25, although he'll be headed right toward extension time. So like that probably be the last year. Then he'll almost for sure extend with the Nets, you would think, unless he asks out. You got Cam Johnson, 21.5. You got player option Dorian Finney-Smith at 15.3, though that one's a little unclear to me what's going to happen. And then after that, like it's with Cam Thomas, he'll be extension L. He'll have been up for a new contract, and we'll see where it goes from there. So just in general, there's just like a ton of financial considerations here. They're already hamstrung with one, and so I don't know. It's just like there's just it basically just highlights what a tricky spot they're in, kind of across the board.
And that's why coming up here in a second, arguably, as we have maybe advocated for, or at least speculated seems to be the most logical stance going forward, is wait one more year before you make the big decisions, before you pursue the big names on the market, because there still are factors, Ben Simmons and his money chief among them, that roll into it. Coming up here in a second, is there any way, though, that they might get out from underneath the Ben Simmons contract? And what would the rotations look like if he's still here? Let's tie a bow on it coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL, plus baseball is in full swing. FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now in FanDuel, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed. You love that word. That's $150, win or lose. You bet on everything. You get the slap shots, the home runs, the slam dunks. Look, it's baseball season. It's hockey season. It's NBA season. It's all happening on FanDuel, and it's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so following the Brian Lewis New York Post article that essentially highlights that as of right now, the Brooklyn Nets intend to support and be behind Ben Simmons and expect him to be a part of this team going forward. As we've always said, $40 million will influence your decision about wanting to keep somebody around. There's two parts to this. Let's just start with the rotation on the surface here too. And it ties into the idea of, I think it's highly unlikely, and you mentioned at the top, that we've both agreed it seems very unlikely the Nets can do anything to get off of the money of Ben Simmons other than just waiting the contract to go out. The one spot where I've pushed a little bit differently is saying, is there either, as you get to the trade deadline, an option? The buyout seems very, very unlikely. But if you're Ben Simmons and you're healthy and you come into training camp and Dennis Schroeder is the starting point guard, and then you get into the second unit, you say, well, yeah, you have a role here, but we're not going to risk messing up having balanced rotations. That's cost us so much over the past 2 seasons. Do you think there's any world where the Nets could effectively paint Ben Simmons into a corner of, well, if you want to take a buyout at a pretty high number, we're not going to take 5 cents on the dollar here, but you could take a buyout because you believe you're healthy and ready to contribute somewhere else. Whereas we are just not going to carve out a substantial role for you here because it's not viable. Clowney's ready to go now. Jalen Wilson stepping into his role. Maybe Dariq Whitehead comes back into the fold here. Like, do you think that that could factor into a Ben Simmons saying, hey, man, you want to buy me out for 30 because I'll still make a ton of money and maybe a team will give me a shot to have an actual role? That would be the one path here where ego drives the ability for the Nets maybe to make a different decision.
Most times you see a buyout, it's because the player knows that they have a landing spot, right? Like the buyout is, sort of put forward and it goes through because the player through their agent, and through just talking with our teams has sort of understood that there's going to be a market for that player. And you see that this is what you often see is that like there's a buyout and then, the guy lands there now. And sometimes there's not buyouts. It kind of just depends. The reason I don't think there would be in this is because I think he's not going to take, even X percentage on the dollar.
Right.
Because I just don't think there's going to be a market. Like, I don't think a team is even going to go there. I mean, unless he's playing crazy good, which is very unlikely. And if that case, then I don't think there'd be a buyout thrown out there. Right. So, because like the only two possible scenarios are playing so good that could be envisioned playing for another team could be like, hey, we'll give it a try. Right. At the minimum. And we'll buy you out. But then the Nets aren't going to probably be incentivized to do it. Or playing so bad that the Nets want to buy out, but then there's nowhere to go. So that's why I just don't see the buyout as like even close to realistic. And just because there's just too much of a track record here, unfortunately, with him. He just has, he's got the injury stuff, which is very documented at this point. And he has the part where he sat out with Philly already once. And I know people want to point to that as like it's not injury related for the umpteenth time. That's
not
worse.
Available related.
It's worse, right? It's worse because
right.
it means you'll sit out for injury and not injury.
Right.
So when it's on the table that you'll sit out for both, that's a worse situation. And I just think that like those factors combined means that they're stuck all the way through the contract. And they're stuck all the way through the contract when it comes to buyouts. I just don't think the buyout's happening. Is the contract tradable? If they attach something else to it, sure. I mean, like you attach a pick to it, it doesn't sweeten the pot at all. But the Nets, if they wanted to attach first round picks to some team to take the money, I'm sure they would do that. But I don't know why the Nets would do that. So I think this is why they're kind of pot stuck.
Yeah, it's interesting too because I think like it's again, and then maybe we differ on this a little bit. It's like, can I see the Nets at next trade deadline that Ben Simmons has at least been healthy and available, and they go, hey, listen, like we don't really want anything in particular. We just want to, move off of the back end of this money, maybe to forge them to go and add a player on the free agent market or at the trade deadline that has a little bit of money associated with it. And you don't want to bump up any more of your cap space. And they're like, yeah, listen, like we'll give it away for nothing. You want to give him a shot for the back half of the season because he's been on the court and available. Great. Low level percentage, but as you would say, higher than 0% chance, however small that may be.
I'll be honest with you though. The part where he gets to the trade deadline and he's been healthy and available the whole time, I would put that close to zero.
Oh, no. Oh, by the way, it's under, I don't know, whatever. It's under 1%, but it's more than 0%. Right? Like to your point, it's very unlikely, but at least it's in the realm of low level possibilities. But even more than that, I think my more interesting discussion here is about what the Brian Lewis article suggests. That Dennis Schroeder has come in. He's brought in leadership. He's brought in experience. He's brought in a desire to be here. He's speaking glowingly about the way he's been welcomed into the organization, wanting to be a part of it. It only cost you $13 million, on the books next year. Decisions about Dorian Finney-Smith. Going back a couple of episodes ago, I talked about how well the young players are performing should, with big double asterisks here, easier for the Brooklyn Nets to make decisions about a veteran like Dorian Finney-Smith. Which makes it interesting about how they approach this. And this is the other factor about it too, because when we think about this offseason, if you go right now and we talk about, where the Nets currently stand, you mentioned, so Dorian Finney-Smith, $15 million. Okay. Dennis Schroeder, $13 million. That's $27 million combined. And then you talk about the cap holds. Right now, Claxton gets labeled with a $16.5 million. So they have $173 million. You're almost $30 million over the cap threshold. They'll avoid the second apron. There's all these different contingencies that they have in place. But there is this weird storm, and maybe is the only factor when it comes to these types of things where, again, and I'm not trying to sell myself or you on this, but if you're making the decision about, okay, are we ready for youth and we can move on from Dorian Finney-Smith? That's $15 million. Do we like Dennis Schroeder, but he has value, so we'll trade him? That's another $13 million. Or do we like having these guys in here? Do we have youth and veterans, and we're keeping Mikal Bridges, we're keeping Cameron Johnson for better or worse? We'll have the discussion all season. We like this core of players going into next year. There is the world where the $40 million of Ben Simmons ends up impacting the way in which you approach these other moves. Whether I think you should trade Dorian Finney-Smith, you may do it because you have this money allocated. And maybe that's the only factor. And this Brian Lewis reporting absolutely spits in the face of it. Would you ever buy him out? Would you ever try to get him off the books? Why, whatever means necessary. No, why would we? We believe in him. He's going to be here. He's going to be healthy. It's going to be great, grand, wonderful. Unless you really want to believe in the blend of players you have, and you don't want to have his $40 million force your hand to make other decisions, which includes Nicholas Claxton. And whether or not you think $16 to $20 million is too much, maybe we can't spend that because Ben Simmons is here. And if we fast forward another year later and Ben Simmons walks off into the sunset through injuries or otherwise, we're going to come right back to this offseason and go, so you didn't make a hard choice about attaching an asset to a bad contract to get him out of here, and you decide to forego keeping your young drafted talent or retaining veterans that you liked. Again, it's all in the spectrum of outcomes here, and I'm not saying what I prefer, but this is that classic Sean Marks Brooklyn Nets front office. What are we doing here? Like, let's make a choice and choose that path. And arguably the path they have chosen is holding pat and bleeding this thing out until it just walks away into a year from now.
And I'm sure if you gave everyone truth serum here and had them say like the actual thing that's happening, it's that last part. It's that we're just waiting for 2025, right? Like, we don't really have any other place to go. We just have to wait till the summer of 2025. We've got ourselves in a real predicament here, right? With the Simmons contract, that's when it runs out. Basically, that's why I went through the contracts before about what's off the books then. Yeah. I think if you actually gave them like the real plan, that's the real plan. But they're never going to say that, because how are you going to sell tickets? It's like, see you in a year, right? Like, you can't ever be forward facing with that kind of plan, because it's basically just telling fans, hey, guess what doesn't matter at all this season, right? Like, and I know it's like not totally true, because you can develop players, you can kind of see what you have, and you can like maybe guys, outperform their, I know there's other things that can happen.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is the real scenario that the Nets are in. And all of it is just treading water time. So if it means saying the nice thing, platitudes about Simmons, and if it means just kind of saying nice things, and that's just what it means. And it's, everyone can see right through it. It's like totally transparent. But what are you going to do? Like, you have to be, the political game is sometimes as easier as much to play as the reality game. So, and I think that's just where they are.
And at the right price point, and this is a tease for, I think, for another offseason discussion. Okay, you bring back Nicholas Claxton. What does another year buy you while Ben Simmons' money is running out? Cam Thomas, keep developing. Keep showing what the other facets of your game are and that you're going to take that next step. Noah Clowney, keep developing, right? To your point, hey, we can still develop our young players while we're in an effectively lost season. And I wonder if that's the factor. But the other part we'll get to here is how having Ben Simmons on the books does influence the pursuit of high talent players this offseason through trades or otherwise. Like, it cannot be an unmitigated factor here. Either he's on the court and that matters and impacts it, or he's not on the court and you're going to have that impact and matter to the team that you build around any players, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, or otherwise. So that's something else, man. As I feel like our content calendar, I'm just going to keep telling you about things we're going to discuss until I have you covered through next October when the next season begins.
I mean, it's so funny because we're gonna be in this constant, like, we're gonna be a little bit of merry-go-round over this offseason, because like not we're stuck, but like the Nets are just in this place where it is just gonna be a very interesting. It's just a very interesting scenario they find themselves. Interesting meaning bad. It's a very bad scenario they find themselves. Bad scenario they find themselves in.
Horrific in terms of interesting.
Which, by the way, thank goodness that like the young guys like Clowney and and Cam Thomas too have played so well here in the short term, because otherwise we'd really be hard pressed. I think the organization would be too. At least there's like a little bit of something to cling on here.
And we have so much, we're going to get out of here. But also now already you're hearing fans say, the young players are playing well. Prepare for the trades this offseason. There's a whole bag of worms to unpack out of that as well about what it means. And all of a sudden it's, when you're hungry, when you're starved, thank you so much for the nice young talent down the end of the stretch. Now, what are they worth? It's a fascinating cycle between fan and organization, especially when it comes to the Nets.
Yeah, I joked about it the other day. I said Noah Clowney's playing just well enough to go join Jared Allen in Cleveland in the Donovan Mitchell trade. So
Perfect.
I'm kidding. All right, we're gonna get out of here. Make
Fine,
sure you
guys.
subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Locked On Nets. Make sure you go hit that subscribe button on YouTube if you haven't done it as well.
Some people are afraid of what they might find if they try to analyze themselves too much, but you have to crawl into your wounds to discover where your fears are. Once the bleeding starts, the cleansing can begin. Why, that is Tori Amos.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. Got me with that one. Yeah, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again next week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.